It is a prime ingredient, feeding the fires of imagination. In eons past, it fanned flames ignited by a primeval author, chiseling random petroglyphs across a dim cave wall. This life-giving breeze once grew papyrus for paper and dried vibrant oils brushed over canvas. Carried across the land since the dawn of time, it once breathed life into dinosaurs and has since walked on the surface of the moon. Manifesting as a gentle zephyr, it stirs memories of childhood, or as a raging vortex ripping up the pages of history. Powered by this influence, we dream, love, laugh, hate, and destroy. In short, live out our lives. A gust of this tempest carries the power to scatter fog surrounding the unknown. Drifting through frequencies of time and space, thin air is inhaled for the first time and exhaled at the last. Don't try to catch your breath.
Some holiday.
Tabitha groaned.
Has anyone even been out here from my company to inspect the land?
Wendell Fife, the man in the driver's seat of the old Ford pickup, glanced over at his passenger, sizing her up. City girl. Office type. Probably never set foot on the desert sand in her lifetime. Of course, he thought, any opportunity to demolish this tiny plot of broken-down eyesores was welcome in his book, even if it meant trading a collection of abandoned buildings for a shiny new strip mall. At least the vagrants and drifters were losing a flophouse, and his commute from Kingman to Grasshopper Junction would be more of a respectable stretch of state road than it had been for as many years as he could remember.
"Not near as I can recollect, miss,"
he replied.
"The Santa Claus Acres has been standing out here since 1937. Closed up shop for good by 2006. Since then, Santa Claus has been listed as AWOL."
Tabitha chuckled.
Santa Claus sure has been abandoned, by all of us grown-ups, that is. Oh, sure, I believed in him when I was little. What kid didn't, you know? I even thought I saw him once in my parents' old house, sneaking a cookie that I had made for him, and then squeezing his fat booty up through the fireplace.
Wendell looked over at her with a questionable expression.
You actually saw Santa Claus?"
Tabitha shifted uneasily in the passenger seat.
Well, of course I didn't.
She went on.
Or maybe it was just my dad dressed in a red suit to keep me believing for another year. Mom and Dad sure did love Christmas. I think it was just wishful thinking on Dad's part. You know, not wanting his little girl to grow up and stop believing in magic. Imaginary friends, Santa and the Easter Bunny, that sort of thing.
"Oh, sure.
Wendell responded.
I guess that's a thing with some people."
Tabitha seemed a little put out by his lack of sentimentality.
Not one for considering things you can't see, are you, Mr. Fife?
Wendell scoffed.
"Well, no sense in daydreaming up a head full of critters. Plenty of real stuff out there in this wide world to lay eyes on without conjuring up stuff that ain't. Heck, I even seen things out here in these parts that most folks might find hard enough to believe in. You see that range of mountains over there? Back in the 50s, I sat right down on the hood of this here pickup and watched mushroom clouds rising out of the Nevada test site from down near Grasshopper Junction. Tell you what, you see something like that coming up like a sunrise at midnight, you ain't never gonna give much thought to things you can't prove or disprove."
Tabitha was incredulous. This guy was much more interesting than her first impression had given him credit for.
You actually saw a nuclear bomb test?
She exclaimed.
That had to have been terrifying.
"Yep, 2 of them. Plumb bob and hardtack. Always worried me some afterwards that I'd grow a second set of earlobes or something."
The pair laughed for a moment, and then the conversation sank into awkward silence. Wendell reached out toward the dash and twisted a knob on the old AM radio, filling the cab with a low hum and static. Turning the tuning knob, he moved the needle across the dimly glowing dial until he came across a barely audible station playing Santa Claus is Coming to Town from what must have been a very great distance away.
There you go, miss. A little bit of the season out here in no man's land.
Fife flipped on the high beams and then stuck a wrinkled, bony finger to point out the dashboard glass.
That'll be Santa Claus Acres. Up here, on your left.
Flipping on his turn signal, the old man paused for a semi to go roaring down the road in the opposite direction, and then eased the pickup off the road and into a sand and gravel parking lot of sorts, obviously no longer maintained. Retrieving a flashlight from beneath the seat, Fife opened the driver's side door and walked around the truck, pulling the door open for Tabitha.
Not much to look at, is she?
He asked as she stepped out to stand next to him.
Getting dark. You sure you don't want to wait until sunup to go scouting around?
Tabitha took the flashlight from him and started walking toward the closest building.
No worries, Wendell.
She said.
I only need 5 or 10 minutes to catalog what gets the wrecking ball. Just keep the motor idling. I'll be right back.
Fife ran a hand through his thinning white hair and sighed.
Okie doke,
He said, sitting down on the running board.
Do what you need to do.
As Tabitha ducked through a rusted barbed wire fence and started weaving over and around the scattered remains littering the grounds, Wendell was surprised to feel something cold fall from the clear, star-studded sky and land on the tip of his nose.
Well, I'll be confounded,
he said.
A snowflake.
Of all the possible places on Earth that one might expect to spend Christmas, the Arizona desert would not be high on the list. Introducing Tabitha Bronson, real estate developer based out of Phoenix, whose job it is to assess a newly acquired property earmarked for development and arrange the required work orders to clear and prepare the site so construction can begin, said property in this case being the sad remnant of a place on the map designated Santa Claus Acres, a dilapidated collection of buildings that are all that remains of a long-ago tourist attraction, now slated for demolition. Odd occurrences notwithstanding, Tabitha is determined to conduct a quick sweep of the grounds, snap a few flash pictures, and then go on to the next project, and forget that Santa Claus ever existed at all. Problem here is this. Has anyone ever been able to put that age-old question to rest? Pushed away like childhood, fantastical characters from our younger years get nudged from our consciousness by passing time and by the very same adults that told us to believe in these entities in the first place. I imagine that Miss Bronson will ultimately unearth the truth about Santa Claus. Whether or not it's the answer she came for can only be speculated. In just a moment, Tabitha will take you on a brief walking trip that may, in fact, have you reevaluating everything you thought you knew about the mystery of childhood and the process of elimination that occurs between the cradle and the grave. They say that all good things come to an end. Perhaps this is true. Perhaps this little parcel of real estate is the thin air into which imaginaries pass when you have become too old to believe in them. Tabitha wasn't particularly tall, but she found that she had to duck down beneath the awning that covered the porch of the Santa Land office.
But of course,
She whispered to herself.
Constructed with elves in mind.
A chill wind whipped in from the desert and blew her hair into a disheveled tangle on one side of her face. As she reached up to brush the strands out of her eyes, she noticed several tiny, glittering snowflakes nestled there. That's curious, she thought. Snowflakes in the desert on a cloudless night? Must be a Christmas miracle. Reaching into the pocket of her skirt, Tabitha pulled out a sizable key ring and shuffled through the keys until she found one labeled Santaland, handwritten on a strip of tape. The doorknob was rusted over from long-term neglect, and took some jimmying to wedge the key into the keyhole, but finally, grudgingly, twisted to unlock. Putting her shoulder into it, Tabitha gave the door a solid push and shoved it aside with a hollow-sounding groan, granting her access to the dilapidated, pint-sized shanty. Shining the flashlight into the room, she was relieved to find that no one had recently taken up residence there, at least not so as anyone was currently home. The room smelled musty to be sure, but not lived in. Holding her phone out in front of her, Tabitha snapped a picture and then proceeded further inside. The lobby, if it even qualified as such, consisted of 2 retro-style broken chairs and a moth-eaten sofa haphazardly taking up space near the center of the room, with a motel-like desk counter built into the back wall. Cobwebs and a thick coating of sand and dust covered every square inch, either settling there undisturbed for years on end or blowing in past glass shards still wedged in a nearby window frame, held there in place by a cracked strip of ancient weather seal.
Mrs. Claus isn't much of a housekeeper these days,
Tabitha said sarcastically.
Probably too busy keeping the old man squeezed into the big red suit.
After popping off a few more shots at other angles inside the room, and one over the counter into the back office, Tabitha put her phone away and headed back toward the door to take a quick look around what was left of the grounds outside. Just as she was about to retrace her steps, she noticed an old postcard rack toppled over on the floor in front of the desk and decided to bend down and take a closer look. Picking up several of the tattered mementos, Tabitha focused her flashlight on a selected handful and swiped away powdery layers of grime to reveal the old photographs beneath. A group of happy children, dressed in 1950s garb, riding a little pink train. A little girl sitting on Santa's lap, holding a brand new teddy bear. Parents and children waving to the camera behind a large banner reading, "Greetings from Santa's home away from home." Feeling a little melancholy at the notion that she was about to greenlight the destruction of this little slice of long-ago holiday adventure, she gathered up one of each of the dozen or so postcards and took them with her as she stood and made her way back outside. As she passed through the doorway and looked up from her little stack of keepsakes, she was greeted with a most unusual scene. It was now snowing quite heavily, so much so that the precipitation was actually sticking and accumulating in small drifts around the grounds.
"Well, I'll be,"
she said incredulously.
Ain't that something else?
Wendell shouted from his truck.
Lived here all my life. I ain't never seen snow like this out here in no man's land.
"No man's land?"
she replied.
"I don't ever remember it snowing this hard down in Phoenix. Flagstaff, sure. Not out here, though."
Tabitha stepped out from under the awning and held out her arms, letting the chill flakes brush past her as the cold wind carried them along. Exhaling, she realized that she could even see her breath. For a moment, at least, Tabitha's thoughts wandered away from the responsibilities of her unamusing job and harkened back to a more innocent time, a moment from her childhood spent back east in the rolling, snow-covered hills and valleys of rural New York State. Giggling, she even stuck her tongue out and let several of the fragile crystals land there, just as she had done as a little girl.
Let me know when you're done playing around in the snow, miss. I didn't dress for this kind of weather,
Wendell complained, pulling the collar of his shirt up around his neck.
I'm getting in the cab, turning the heat on full blast. Might even try to catch a snooze for a minute or two.
"Sure thing, Mr. Fife. I'm sorry. I won't be much longer,"
she replied. Snapping back from the temporary euphoria, Tabitha turned her attention toward the other remaining structures on the grounds, namely the large Christmas tree inn building and a couple of little shacks in the lot directly behind it. As she made her way back in that direction, she kicked a couple of stray tumbleweeds out of her path and noticed that the remains of the little pink train pictured on one of the postcards was parked in a bramble of overgrown desert scrubgrass and prickly pear cacti. Tragically stripped of a once playful veneer, The small, gas-powered engine and row of child-sized railroad cars were now encrusted with haphazard graffiti, beneath which chipped pink paint had been sanded bare by the elements to reveal rotting plywood boards that made up the walls, flooring, and seats of the Santa Express. Tabitha stepped up into one of the cars and sat down in the seat, barely wide enough to accommodate an adult passenger. Suddenly realizing that her eyes were tearing up, she quickly wiped away the drops before they had a chance to smear her makeup, and then once again got back to the sad business at hand. Standing, she heard Wendell's old truck backfire and stall. Several seconds later, she caught the tail end of a litany of swear words from inside the cab as Wendell woke up and stomped down hard on the clutch pedal to restart the engine. Tabitha laughed at poor Wendell's man-against-machine verbal assault, particularly in light of the fact that his incessant shouting was muffled and seemingly ineffective contained behind the rolled-up windows as he fought to keep warm. After a moment, the truck resumed idling, and the old man dozed off to sleep again, his hot breath fogging up the dashboard glass as he carried on, snoring. Turning her flashlight between the two largest buildings, Tabitha walked away from the roadside parking area and wandered back toward the smaller huts that must have been part of a children's playground. One of the miniature houses reminded her of the brick house from the Three Little Pigs, the last brick-and-mortar structure built by the pigs so that the big bad wolf couldn't huff and puff and blow it all down. Much like the beloved story, this little domicile seemed to have endured the test of time better than the rest of this sad piece of forgotten real estate. Tabitha snapped a picture of the outside, but decided that since the building had been securely boarded up, there was no point in trying to gain access. One shot for prosperity, and the wrecking ball could take care of the rest in less time than it took to compose the photograph. Surprisingly, the flash on Tabitha's phone must have spooked one of the native wildlife. Some kind of animal bolted out from under a gnarled Joshua tree and scurried away back toward the wall of the Santa Land office. In the dim blue glow of soft moonlight filtering down from above, the creature appeared to Tabitha as little more than a silhouetted dark outline. Redirecting the beam of her flashlight, she illuminated the area but still couldn't make out exactly what kind of animal she had startled. Until it whinnied.
"Well, I'll be,"
Tabitha exclaimed.
"You're a little horse, aren't you?"
Focusing her beam directly at the head and neck of the pint-sized beastie, she immediately saw a pair of dark brown eyes looking back at her inquisitively. The little pony didn't try to break and run as she approached, just stood there like a beautiful apparition in the drifting snow.
"It's okay, little one. I won't hurt you,"
Tabitha said gently.
"This is kind of a scary place to be galloping around in at night. Don't you have a home, a ranch, or someplace nearby that you can go home to?"
The horse turned its ears, listening intently to the sound of her voice. As she stepped within reach, Tabitha placed her outstretched hand on the pony's soft mane and started stroking its head and neck.
"You're so pretty,"
she told the little animal.
"I bet you probably have a little girl back at home that likes to take long rides in the desert with you."
The pony turned its downy head upward and quite unexpectedly licked the side of Tabitha's face, giving her a big, wet, horsey kiss.
"Aww,"
Tabitha said, hugging the horse.
"You're a pushover in the friendship department. You don't have any idea, do you, that I came out here to take away your playground? You make me wish I didn't have to, that's for sure."
Resting her palm on the horse's back, she looked around the surroundings and sighed.
"Too bad,"
she said, lamenting.
"People don't have time for this sort of place anymore. For that matter, there's barely any time at all just to enjoy being a kid. Nowadays, the sense of magic is completely artificial. It's a wonder that anyone believes in anything. That is, if it can't be conjured up on a video display.
The horse nickered and shook its head side to side, scattering a plume of snowflakes into the air. Tabitha laughed.
Hey!
She shouted.
That's cold!
With that, the little pony turned and started trotting away around the corner of the office.
Wait for me!
Tabitha called out.
We need to find out where you came from and get you back where you belong.
As Tabitha rounded the building after the horse, she was sad to discover that it was now nowhere in sight. There, in its place, Tabitha came face to face with yet another startling manifestation. Rising up from the littered, dismal landscape stood a pristine, towering Christmas tree, completely decked out from trunk to tree topper with twinkling red, green, and white lights. High atop the glistening branches, a shimmering silver star capped off the vision in perfect majesty, somehow transforming this sad epitaph into a miraculous night to remember. Without so much as a second thought, Tabitha lifted up her phone and quickly took a picture, half inspired by the beauty of the moment, half because she doubted her own senses and wanted some kind of physical proof that this wasn't just a crazed hallucination. Tapping the screen long enough to retrieve the image and make sure that it was genuine, she returned the phone to her pocket and stood silently gazing up at the tree. After several seconds, the little horse stepped up beside her and tucked its furry head under her arm.
Well, hello again,
she said, looking down.
Tell me, did you have something to do with this?
Of course, the horse didn't reply, simply stood there by her side, like a deer in the headlights, equally mesmerized by the unlikely display. Having the little horse there by her side was strangely, almost overwhelmingly comforting, and Tabitha knelt down, hugging it tightly.
Merry Christmas,
she whispered.
You make me feel like I'm about 6 years old again.
For a timeless moment, the pair just looked up at the tree. As Tabitha's gaze fell upon the lowest branches, she noticed something colorful and shiny tucked down below the wide base of the thick pine needles.
Hey,
she said.
There's a package under there.
The horse whinnied again and then sat down in the snow on its haunches. Tabitha crawled forward and ducked down, low enough that she could reach her arm far enough to retrieve the brightly wrapped gift. Lifting it up in the moonlight, she said,
You don't suppose...
Her sentence trailed off to a whisper. As she spoke, she was opening a tiny card that had been taped to the wrapping paper next to a bright red bow. On the card was written, To Tabitha from Santa Claus.
Oh my.
Looking back at the horse, she said,
This package, it's a gift to me, from Santa.
The pony turned its head to one side, listening. Slowly, carefully, Tabitha started tearing away the wrapping to reveal a brown cardboard box. Carefully lifting the lid as if this were some sort of magical, corrugated paper treasure chest, she turned the box over in her hand and was about to reach inside when all at once a brilliant orange flame shimmered to life and rose out through the opening. Floating before her like a tiny, levitating wick on top of a disembodied, invisible candle, the flame seemed to be giving off heat, but didn't feel threatening or flammable in any way. Brushing her palm across the tip of the flickering fire, she felt warmth, but no pain, no blistering skin on her fingertips, only soothing heat that felt good to the touch, a welcome sensation standing out here in the chilly, drifting snow.
Wait a minute,
she said pensively.
I remember you.
As if the light given off by the glowing ball of energy had suddenly illuminated a notion long forgotten, Tabitha stared wide-eyed in recognition, suddenly aware that this moment was, in fact, a reunion.
Murphy? My imaginary friend from childhood?
Incredulous, She sat the box and wrapping paper down in the snow and backed away, realizing that something out here in the darkness was bordering on nothing short of paranormal.
It can't possibly be,
She went on.
You're not real. You never were. I only imagined you to fill a void of loneliness I felt as a child growing up.
As if somehow affected by the utterance of her words, the flame dimmed and looked as if it were on the verge of winking out. Then, all at once, another revelation struck, and Tabitha looked over at the tiny horse.
Bruce?
She asked. The pony bobbed its head up and down and snorted, blowing a big cloud of steam into the cold air that wafted past the candle and almost snuffed it the rest of the way out. Laughing and crying tears of joy, she wrapped her arms around the horse again and hugged him tightly.
Bruce, Murphy, my two imaginary friends from long ago. I don't understand how or why it's happened, but you've come back. My mom and dad told me you weren't real, that I just made you up, imagined you, so I would have friends to talk to and play with. I never realized that you were both actually more than a notion from childhood.
Bruce trotted over to the drifting fireball and sniffed at it. In response, the orb of light blazed brightly again and spun several orbits around the horse's head, making it look as if you were wearing some sort of brilliant, angelic orange halo. Scooping up 2 handfuls of powdery snow, Tabitha tossed it over her head, which, in turn, rained down on top of her friends, causing the fire to sputter and sizzle, and the horse to shake a blanket of flakes off in a nebulous cloud of white glitter. Giggling at the flurry that momentarily clouded her vision, Tabitha wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her shirt and then looked out beyond where Bruce stood picking at a tuft of scrub brush wedged in the cracked foundation of the nearby building. To Tabitha's complete surprise, the grounds behind the office had somehow completely transformed. Ruination suddenly becoming glistening white snowdrifts, gossamer blankets covering filthy sand dunes. In the distance, equally spaced around the far side of the central plaza, were the mystical houses of the 3 little pigs, richly bathed in technicolor splendor and fully restored to storybook accuracy. Nearer to the center of the courtyard, and almost completely covered over by snow, was a small curving knoll with a brightly painted wooden door and small circular window embedded in the side of the earthen mound. Clearly marked by an equally colorful signpost, this tiny underground dwelling apparently belonged to the Easter Bunny. Across the beautifully shimmering landscape near the house of bricks was a pumpkin patch, row after row of glowing, marmalade-colored jack-o'-lanterns, each uniquely carved with silently laughing expressions, a muted audience with ringside seating to this imaginary performance. Tabitha's jaw dropped in absolute disbelief as she gazed out across the fantastical vista. An odd mix of wonder and fright started overtaking her senses, and almost without thinking she cried out,
Wendell!
Hopelessly transfixed on the vision, she had no idea whether he heard her or not, whether he was even within earshot, or if so, had once again nodded off to sleep. Deciding that perhaps the moment might be fleeting, Tabitha advanced alongside the Santa Land office and carefully made her way down the ornate cobblestone pathway leading in and around the sparkling snowdrifts. Flanked by Bruce and Murphy, the trio stepped, clomped, and sizzled their way along, magically illuminated in a ring of light cast from Murphy's flickering, nebulous form. Everywhere she looked, they were completely immersed in what Tabitha could only comprehend as a child's dream come true. It wasn't just the collective trappings of Christmas time either. Of course, the domicile of the bunny was an obvious deviation, as were the jack-o'-lanterns. Incredibly, the suspension of belief was not seemingly limited to any specific cast of characters. While she had yet to encounter them, Tabitha could only assume that the fairy tale houses of the three little pigs were occupied, and at any moment the big bad wolf was going to make the scene to cause a disturbance. While she stared intently at the formidable house of bricks for signs of activity, a strange, fluttering apparition caught her eye, floating down in her direction from somewhere out of the star-filled blackness above. As the silhouetted form gracefully approached, the outline took on the unmistakable persona of an elderly woman, hovering in midair by way of a pair of fluttering wings protruding from her shoulder blades. Tabitha had just enough time to utter,
"What the?"
before the pint-sized lady with dragonfly wings glided effortlessly down among the gently falling snowflakes in a graceful arc across the courtyard, until she stopped in midair, directly in front of Tabitha.
"Hello, Tabitha,"
the woman whispered quietly.
"As you have probably deduced, I'm the Tooth Fairy. When the other Imaginaries told me you were coming, I must admit that I was at once filled with an overwhelming sense of closure and relief. If you recall, I made a very serious oversight on your behalf a few years back. 37, to be exact, I think, when you were approximately 9.5 years old.
Thinking back all those years ago, Tabitha tried to remember what she could possibly be talking about. For a moment, she simply stood there, scratching her chin. Obviously sensing a complete lack of recall, the little old lady with gossamer wings leaned forward and tapped a withered finger on Tabitha's cheek.
"Oh, what? Your cuspit, my dear. I shortchanged you."
Pulling the drawstring of a small canvas bag she wore draped over one shoulder, the fairy reached inside and produced a freshly minted quarter. Pinching the coin between her thumb and forefinger, she held it up in front of a brass-rimmed glass monocle she held clenched in the socket of her left eye, and squinted at it intently. Seemingly satisfied, she then extended her hand to Tabitha. Bewildered, Tabitha took the quarter from her and closed it tightly in her palm.
"Thank you,"
she responded.
"Though, at the moment, I have no idea what I need 25 cents for."
The Tooth Fairy looked dumbfounded.
"Why, to spend on something nice for yourself, Tabitha, my dear. You had to pull a tooth out to earn that bit of treasure. Don't let your parents decide. Treat yourself to something extra special."
Tabitha nearly lost her composure and laughed at the fairy, but then it was, after all, quite touching.
"When I was 9 years old, yeah, maybe.
She conjectured.
I suppose a quarter might still buy a gumball or something. Ironically, something to chip a tooth on." "That's very sweet of you,"
she responded.
"I'm curious, though. Why are you only now getting around to paying me?"
The Tooth Fairy looked down at her feet, seemingly embarrassed.
"Lots of kids lost teeth that night, and I was in a hurry. It was a simple oversight for which I have no other excuse. After that night, there was no official recourse. I had to wait for you to come to me. Anyway,"
she said, clicking her tongue on her teeth,
"all's well that ends well. Farewell, Tabitha, and don't spend it all in one place."
Having finally rectified a decades-old dilemma, now marked paid in full, the little woman turned away and climbed several feet into the air overhead, high enough to clear the rooftop of the brick house, as she took off and fluttered effortlessly over the smoking chimney and out of sight. Apparently intimidated by close proximity to the fairy, Bruce trotted out of the nearby shadows to stand by Tabitha's side, and the tiny horse snorted his disapproval for small, flying women handing out money. Tabitha looked down at him and laughed.
"It's all right, boy,"
she assured him.
"I don't think any of your imaginary teeth are loose, are they?"
Bruce shook his head and snorted again, then bounded down the path at a gallop, kicking up a glistening white contrail of snow in his wake.
"Missy! Hey, you out here somewheres about?"
Wendell's voice sounded urgent, yet incredibly comforting under the circumstances.
Down here, Mr. Fife, near the house of bricks.
Tabitha turned in the direction of his voice and watched the bobbing beam of a flashlight as it slowly approached.
What in tarnation you doing all the way out here? Stalking Gila monsters?
Tabitha scoffed.
Your guess is as good as mine,
She replied.
The corporate office never told me this place was so enchanting.
Winded, Wendell staggered to a stop and pointed the flashlight up at his face, bathing his features in an unnatural combination of light and shadow. In response to her observation, his eyes looked left, then right, surveying the immediate surroundings.
Enchanting, you say? That's an interesting assessment, to be sure.
Wendell aimed the flashlight beam at Tabitha.
You feeling okay, miss? Probably the cold. Why don't you let me walk you back to the truck, and we'll do this another day. Daylight time, when there's no chance of stepping on a rattler.
Tabitha squinted into the glare.
Mr. Fife, something tells me that if I'd waited till the day after Christmas, none of this would be happening.
Wendell looked confused.
I'm sorry, ma'am. None of this, you say?
At that moment, several flakes of blowing snow fluttered across his field of vision. Figuring that the unusual weather conditions must be what she was referring to, he said,
Oh yeah, the snowfall. Odd thing that. Unlikely out here in these parts, but surely not impossible. Global warming, most likely.
Tabitha took hold of Wendell's hand and turned the flashlight back in his direction.
No, not the snow. All of this. A pristine Christmas tree with a single package beneath it, intended especially for me. My two imaginary friends from childhood, Bruce and Murphy, here in this place. So yes, Mr. Fife, enchanting to say the least.
Wendell just stood there, speechless, sizing her up like a few crayons short of a box. Concerned about her odd state of mind, he said,
Look, Tabitha, is it? Nice hot cup of black coffee is what you need right now. There's a diner, a little all-nighter back down the road a mile or two. Let's get you in out of the cold, a little caffeine in your veins. You'll be as right as rain.
Wait a minute, Wendell.
Tabitha replied, incredulous.
You mean to tell me you can't see what's happening here? Just look around. Over there.
She said, pointing.
The field of jack-o'-lanterns. And there, next to them, the houses of the three little pigs. How do you explain it all?
Kneeling down, Tabitha wrapped her arms around Bruce's furry neck.
This, Wendell, is my imaginary horse. His name is Bruce. He's here, and he's really real. Flesh and blood. Not imaginary after all. And,
She went on,
that little flame flickering over your head, you see it? That's my other friend, Murphy. Maybe not flesh and blood so much, but still, he's here. He's really, truly here.
Tabitha stood and looked for understanding in Wendell's eyes, but saw none. On the contrary, the old man stared back at her with a palatable doubt in his expression, the look of someone convinced now that it was most likely a straitjacket, rather than a hot cup of coffee, that would be required to resolve the situation rationally, at least from his perspective.
Now look here,
He stated cautiously.
if you're just funning around, then fair enough. You got me. Wool over my eyes, pulling my leg, Christmas cheer, whatever you want to call it. Can't say I'm much amused, but then a sense of humor has never been one of my endearing qualities. Then again, if you're being serious and all, well then, I'm afeard you're in need of some serious looking after.
This time, it was Wendell pointing a finger, not at some nearby oddity, but straight at Tabitha.
Now, missy, you tell me, which is it?
Judging by the nervous twitching of his outstretched finger, Tabitha decided in favor of discretion.
Had you going, didn't I?
She replied, forcing a smile.
Come on, Wendell. It's Christmas. You know, deck the halls and ho ho ho. Rudolph and Frosty. Look, you're allowed to be serious for 364 days a year. Is it so wrong to let a little magic sink in at least once on the 25th of December?
Still unsure about the mental state of this seemingly high-strung out-of-towner, Wendell lowered his accusatory arm to his side and cleared his throat.
So then,
he asked,
Santa Acres, still just that? Acreage, in desperate need of bulldozers and a wrecking ball?
This time, Tabitha's smile was genuine.
Of course, Wendell. What else would it be?
In the dim twilight, the old man didn't notice when Tabitha glanced down and winked knowingly at Bruce. Then she added,
Now, is that offer still good? A hot cup of joe sounds just about right.
Wendell held her in the flashlight beam for another moment or two, then redirected it back toward the parking lot.
2 cups, coming right out,
he said, chuckling, visibly relieved that she seemed perfectly fine now. Then again, he obviously overlooked a small pink train, the Santa Express, now returned to service as it chugged to a stop near the walkway, just long enough for Bruce and Murphy to board. Walking a few steps behind her clearly unimaginative companion, Tabitha blew her dear friends a kiss and waved, not goodbye, just more of a see you later. Once the pair got back to the truck, Wendell politely wrenched open the passenger door and held it until Tabitha was seated and buckled in. After he had climbed in behind the wheel, he turned the key in the ignition and waited for the reluctant engine to turn over. When it finally did, he kept the old pickup idling long enough for the dashboard heater to blow a trace current of warm air. Holding his hand over one of the vents, he said,
She'll be nice and toasty in a minute or two.
Then rolled his eyes, obviously sarcastic.
That's okay, Wendell. I don't mind the cold. I find it to be sort of eye-opening, actually. A breath of fresh air.
As they sat there waiting to get underway, in a long, drawn-out moment of awkward silence, Fife finally asked,
What was all that back there, anyway? That rigmarole about the Imaginaries and such?
Tabitha gazed longingly out the dashboard glass, wanting more than anything to go back, to run and play, as she did as a child, chasing after her friends and trying to catch the dreams they once represented.
It was nothing really, Mr. Fife. Just wishful thinking, I suppose. Every once in a while, I find myself thinking back to a simpler time. What seemed so important to me then was to get on with growing up. Once you get there, grown, that is, you realize just how priceless those days of childhood really were. By then the park is closed, and the horses of the carousel have all gone away.
Fife turned to face her.
Horses?
He repeated.
Yeah. Bruce was one of those horses. In my imagination, he followed me home one day after my parents took me to ride the carousel one last time. The land was sold and the merry-go-round demolished so they could build a strip mall.
Tabitha turned to face Wendell, and he saw that she was crying. Pulling a handkerchief from the pocket of his shirt, he tried to console her.
There now, missy. Don't cry,
he said, holding the cloth to her cheek. One of her tears fell and dripped across the back of his hand.
I'm sorry I got cross with you back there. It's just that...
Wendell's voice trailed off to a whisper as the seed of an idea took root. Unexpectedly, he twisted the handle and kicked the driver's side door wide open, letting a blast of chill air and snow into the otherwise toasty cab interior.
Wendell? Hey, where are you going?
She stammered. The old man didn't reply. All Tabitha could hear were his footfalls as he trudged out across the thick blanket of snow, the sound itself soon lost in the ambient rush of wind. Sitting up rail straight on the seat, she wiped the remnant of cold tears from her eyes and peered out into the gathering darkness, illuminated only superficially by the glow of the truck's headlamps. Glancing over at the steering column, she realized she had no idea how to drive this whatchamacallit, this 3-on-a-tree. Feeling stranded out here in no man's land, as Fife had put it, the sense of isolation was palpable and immediate, and the notion that she had just now been abandoned in the desert with a host of paranormal activity unfolding all around her was almost more than she could bear. Then, all at once, something smacked the outside of the passenger side window with a wet, sloshy thud. Tabitha turned, only to see the trace evidence of impact, semi-transparent globs of melting slush, fragments of a snowball. Somewhere amid the blustery zephyr outside, she distinctly overheard Wendell Fife laughing hysterically.
"Whoa now! I had you with that one,"
he shouted.
"It ain't fair at all, you hold up in there. Get out here and defend yourself."
The tables now obviously having been turned, Tabitha wondered just how stable her driver had been. Granted, he wasn't seeing any imaginary friends. Now, however, he seemed to have become completely unhinged.
Mr. Fife, what on earth do you think you're doing?
She shouted. Fife let out a long coyote howl, and seconds later, another snowball hit the hood and sent particles of powder spraying in all directions.
"I'm having myself a snowball fight,"
he announced,
"albeit one-sided at the moment. Come on now, let's see what you got."
She could hear Wendell begin packing another snowball. At that very same instant, the sense of magic she felt earlier came flooding back to her, and a singular course of action became apparent. Mischief. Slinking around the far side of the truck bed to crouch behind the tailgate, Tabitha scooped up ample handfuls of snow and quickly piled up a stack of ammunition along the back bumper.
Anytime you're ready, Wendell.
She chided.
I'm a sitting duck.
Wendell Fife leaped to his feet and charged, snowball in hand, completely unprepared for the rapid-fire barrage that landed on target, square in the face, sending him careening into a snowdrift. Victorious, Tabitha stood up and danced around as if she just scored the winning touchdown.
She shoots, she scores,
she said, laughing. Then, stepping up to Wendell, she helped him back to his feet.
"Quite an arm you got there, miss,"
he told her as he pulled clumps of snow from his beard stubble.
"Never even saw it coming."
Tabitha brushed the snow off the old man's shoulders.
Clearly, I am the snowball champion,
she said.
Now, what do you say we call a truce and pool our efforts and build ourselves a snowman?
There was an enchanting twinkle in her eyes, a wonder that even Wendell couldn't deny. As Tabitha clumped some snow together and started rolling it around the lot, doubling and then tripling its size, Wendell saw that she was having increasing difficulty pushing.
"Just you and me rolling this thing out then, miss? Or will your little pint-sized stallion over there be lending us a hoof or two?"
Tabitha stopped rolling her frosty orb and glanced up to see that Bruce had returned from his train ride and was now watching from the porch of the Santa Land office.
"So you do see him after all,"
she exclaimed.
"I didn't want to at first,"
Wendell replied.
Just me being all stubborn-like. Something clicked about your horse, though. Turned down the merry-go-round and such. It got me thinking. After that, he just sort of showed up."
Tabitha grinned and wrapped her arms around Fife and gave him a hug.
"Merry Christmas, Wendell,"
she said. Wendell hugged her back and then stepped up to the sizable body she had made for the snowman, preparing to roll it even bigger.
"What are we calling this here fella?"
he asked.
Frosty?
Tabitha shook her head.
"No, I don't think so,"
she sighed, frowning.
"Probably copyrighted."
Making her way back to the office, she disappeared inside and then reappeared a few moments later carrying a big red coat and hat. Wendell's look of surprise was priceless.
"Well, it is Santa Land after all,"
she exclaimed.
"And I saw these hanging on a hook in there behind the desk when I was kicking things around."
As Wendell went about the business of rolling out snowy St. Nick, he said,
Santa it is. Though this here snowball definitely needs to put on a few more pounds."
Eventually, they were both putting their backs into it, finally rolling the enormous body into place next to the Christmas tree at the corner of the office awning. After that, the pair each took on the separate task of rolling out a torso and finally a head. When they wrapped the coat around their completed creation, they were both amazed to discover that, miraculously, the coat fit like a glove. Finally, Wendell hoisted Tabitha up on his shoulders and positioned her close enough to reach out and place the cap on top, the finishing touch on a wondrous night to remember. In an effort to step back and examine their masterwork Santa, Wendell tripped over a broken chunk of asphalt and toppled over backwards into a deep snowdrift. Tabitha fell quite a distance from her perch, but thankfully the snow broke her fall, and she landed unharmed. Wendell was beside himself and was about to apologize when he saw that she was laughing, partly due to the fun she was having, and partly because Bruce had galloped to her rescue, said rescue being a face full of wet, horsey kisses.
Thank you,
he said, helping her to her feet.
You've restored my faith in human nature. Showed me that the wonder I thought was lost,
Tabitha finished his sentence,
can still be found.
From the pocket of her dress, Tabitha's phone rang. Looking at the caller ID on the screen, she saw it was the home office.
I'm sorry, Mr. Five. I should probably take this.
Oh, sure,
Wendell responded.
I'll go bring the truck around.
Trudging back toward the headlights, his cheery disposition started to wane, sudden reality pushing it back behind his lifelong empty facade.
Yep, Flat's real estate.
All right,
Bronson
you
speaking.
daggone tin-plated rattletrap. Time to ease on down the road. Think you might be up for it?
The driver's side door was still hanging open, left that way during the snowball fight, which probably meant it was colder than a brass toilet seat in Siberia inside the cab. Oddly, the dashboard radio was switched on, and the tinny little speaker over the glove box was crackling away with a far-off rendition of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. Fife got behind the wheel and pulled a stick of Beeman's chewing gum out of the ashtray, gnashing it between his teeth. As he stomped down on the clutch and put the pickup in gear, his brain registered the fact that it was no longer snowing, but for some reason it didn't seem to matter. Carefully steering a path over to where Tabitha still stood, talking on her phone, Wendell took one last fleeting glance at the discarded holiday ghost town.
Confounded eyesore. Good riddance to you, I say.
The old truck's brakes screeched loudly as it pulled to a stop, waiting for his passenger to wrap things up. He couldn't hear what she was saying over the rumble of the sputtering engine, and for certain he couldn't read lips. So when Tabitha finally did climb in and pull the door shut behind her, he figured that this small, strange chapter of his long and otherwise unremarkable life had unceremoniously come to an end.
Yeah, all set, miss?
He asked. Tabitha looked over at him, grinning from ear to ear.
Mr. Five, what would you say if I told you we just made a down payment on a very unique piece of real estate?
Unique indeed. Santa Claus Acres didn't crumble into history beneath the wrecking ball, as was the original plan. Instead, a pair of highly imaginative investors bought up what was left of the property and eventually transformed it into an honest-to-goodness tourist mecca. People came from all across the globe to visit Santa's little home away from home, coming away not with overpriced souvenirs, but with a sense of wonder that lingered long after a day spent there. No animatronics, no computer-generated virtual reality, just a visit to some place vaguely familiar, a whisper, telling us that one need not grow old after all, need not outgrow the magical beings conjured to life by the limitless power of imagination. Nothing more than a little errant wish, you say? Perhaps. Then again, it snowed in the desert one night, and two people who were lost found themselves once again, with the help of some imaginary friends who came back, seemingly out of thin air.
Hey, man, what is that? Look at that.
What is it, man? What do you see?
over there in front of the old Santa Acres dump. It's a humongous snowman, all dressed up like Santa Claus.
Whoa, dude, slow down. I want to get a picture.
All right, chill, dude. Here, I'll even roll down the window so you can get a better view.
Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas. Dude, that's no snowman. That's the real Santa. Look, he's walking this way.
Oh, that's it, bro. We're out of here.
Well, I guess that's that. New boys are on the naughty list next year.
Episode 9 of the Thin Air podcast anthology, The Imaginaries, a 2021 Thin Air holiday special, was written, produced, directed, and told by R.J. Lonsdale. The voice of Tabitha Bronson was performed by Valerie Lonsdale. The voice of the Tooth Fairy was performed by Nancy Wood, and the voice of the Snowman was performed by Mark Wood. Audio production for all Thin Air episodes by Mark W. Wood of Wood Media Studio, Incorporated. Music compositions used in this episode include Mysterious City and Mary Gents, It's Snow Time, and To Grinch or Not to Grinch by Mark W. Wood. This has been an R.J. Lonsdale Flyby Studios presentation.